A biography of Diogenes, an enigma. 1. Sources and the shape of his story. Diogenes of Sinope is one of the most vivid figures from ancient philosophy, but he is also one of the hardest to see clearly. Almost everything we know about him comes from anecdotes recorded centuries after he lived, mainly in Diogenes Laertius's lives of eminent philosophers, along with Plutarch, Athenaeus, and a handful of other authors. These sources are less like modern biographies and more like collections of moral fables, short, sharp stories designed to illustrate character and philosophical point rather than to document events with precision. Many of the tales about Diogenes were probably reshaped, exaggerated, or even invented by later cynics and admirers who wanted him to stand as the perfect embodiment of their ideals. When we tell his life, we are always moving in the borderland between history and legend. Still, if we treat the anecdotes as philosophical stories rather than courtroom evidence, a fairly consistent picture emerges. That of a man who turned his entire existence into a living argument about what truly matters. 2. Sinope. Birth, family, and the coinage scandal. Diogenes was born in Sinope, a Greek colony on the Black Sea in what is now northern Turkey. Ancient reports give overlapping dates, but scholars generally place his birth around the end of the 5th century BCE, sometime between 413 and 403. His father, Hycetius, is said to have been a trapezite, a kind of banker or money changer connected to the city's mint. Diogenes himself may have held a minor civic post related to the management of coinage. The young Diogenes' life, then, seems to have begun within the respectable world of local politics and finance. That world collapsed in scandal. Several ancient accounts claim that Diogenes, his father, or both were involved in debasing Sinope's currency, tampering with the coinage for profit or under political pressure. Whether Diogenes was truly guilty or made a convenient scapegoat is impossible to say, but the story has him condemned or at least disgraced. He either fled before punishment or was formally exiled. Archaeological evidence of altered Sinopean coins from that period lends a little weight to the tradition, but the details remain hazy. What matters for his later image is how this episode was reinterpreted. Cynic writers delighted in the pun that he debased the currency. Not only literally, but morally, he would go on, they said, to restamp the coinage of values themselves, exposing the conventional respect paid to wealth, status, and reputation as counterfeit. In some versions, an oracle at Delphi even told him to adulterate the currency, a riddling command that he first obeyed literally and then discovered how to fulfill philosophically. Exile turned out to be the turning point of his life. Stripped of property, position, and civic identity, Diogenes later presented banishment not as a tragedy, but as a kind of liberation. The shock of losing everything pushed him to ask which human needs were real and which were simply habits enforced by law and custom. Out of that question, his cynicism was born. 3. Athens and the making of a cynic. After leaving Sinope, Diogenes made his way to Athens, the intellectual and political heart of the Greek world. There he encountered a landscape of flourishing philosophical schools, many of them shaped by the legacy of Socrates. One of Socrates' followers, Antisthenes, had developed a severe, ethics-centered philosophy that emphasized virtue, self-sufficiency, and indifference to external goods. Later tradition presents Diogenes as Antisthenes' pupil, sometimes describing him as pursuing the older philosopher so relentlessly that Antisthenes tried to drive him off with a stick, only to be told that he would find no stick hard enough to drive Diogenes away from learning. Whether this is chronologically precise is doubtful, but it captures the underlying connection. Diogenes inherited a Socratic seriousness about virtue and turned it into something fiercer, stranger, and more theatrical. In Athens, he began to live in a way that shocked not only polite society but even other philosophers. He owned virtually nothing, wore a rough cloak that also served as his blanket, went barefoot much of the time, and slept in public spaces. His whole life slowly took on the shape of a protest against conventional desires. The Athenians, amused and offended, nicknamed him the Dog, and from that label the name of his school, Cynicism from kynikos, dog-like, would evolve. Diogenes embraced the insult. For him, the dog was the honest animal. It lived simply, took what it needed, and barked at those who threatened it. To be dog-like was to strip human life back to its natural essentials and refuse the pretenses of social vanity. 4. Life in a jar. Simplicity as experiment. The most famous image of Diogenes shows him living in a large storage jar, often misrepresented as a barrel. In Greek, it was a pythos, a huge clay container used for storing grain or wine. He kept this jar near the marketplace, where the life of the city flowed past him. In winter, he sheltered inside it. In summer, he slept outside in the open air. His cloak served as both clothing and bedding. His possessions were reduced to a handful of items he could carry easily. The container was more than a dwelling. It was a symbol of his chosen poverty and his deliberate break with domestic expectations of house, furniture, and guarded privacy. Stories of small adjustments in his lifestyle show how consciously experimental he was. In one anecdote, he sees a boy scooping water from a fountain using cupped hands. Realizing that he does not need even the simple wooden cup he has been carrying, Diogenes throws it away, remarking that he has been outdone in simplicity by a child. In another, he roams the city at noon with a lit lamp. Asked what he is doing, he replies, "I'm looking for a human being." Sometimes this is rendered as looking for an honest man, but the Greek suggests something more pointed. Diogenes is implying that most people fail to live up to their own humanity, that they are so warped by convention and desire that he cannot easily find a truly human life among them. These images of the jar, the discarded cup, the daylight lamp are not random eccentricities. They are physical manifestations of his philosophical question: what exactly does a human being need in order to live well? Each object he abandons becomes a small victory against dependency, and each public gesture becomes a kind of riddle posed to the crowd. 5. Shamelessness and moral theatre. To his contemporaries, Diogenes' behavior often seemed deliberately outrageous. He ate simple food, but did so wherever and whenever hunger struck, including in places where public eating was considered rude. Some stories say he relieved himself or masturbated in public, and when challenged, he responded with jokes that pointed to the double standard. People were shocked by natural bodily acts performed openly, but untroubled by greed, flattery, and cruelty. Whether every scandalous detail is historically accurate is impossible to determine. What matters is that the Cynics themselves embraced the idea of anaideia, shamelessness, as a tool of moral training. For Diogenes, shamelessness did not mean that nothing is shameful. Instead, it meant retraining the sense of shame so that it responds only to genuine vice, to feel shame for eating, sleeping, or satisfying bodily needs, while feeling none for lying, manipulating, or seeking office purely for honor, was a sign that the moral compass had been reversed by blatantly crossing social boundaries. He aimed to expose how arbitrary many of them were. His body became a medium for argument, a moving demonstration that nature and convention are not the same. His words were as sharp as his actions. He was renowned for cutting one-line responses that pricked inflated reputations. When a proud citizen boasted about his prestigious hometown, Diogenes is said to have stamped his foot and replied that the city had been disgraced simply by counting such a man among its citizens. When he saw a young man blushing, he reportedly commented that this was the color of virtue, encouraging him to keep a sense of shame where it truly belonged. Even these small exchanges show how he used ridicule not merely to wound, but to redirect attention from shallow honors to moral character. 6. Slavery, exile, and inner freedom. One dramatic cluster of stories places Diogenes on a voyage during which he is captured by pirates and sold as a slave in Corinth. When put up for sale and asked what he could do, he is supposed to have answered that he knew how to govern men and should therefore be sold to someone who needed a master. A Corinthian named Xeniades bought him and set him over his household as a tutor for his sons. Diogenes then reportedly reshaped the entire household, instructing the boys in simple living and honest speech, and treating the family as a microcosm of his ideal community. Although we cannot verify the historical accuracy of this episode, its philosophical message is clear and deeply cynic. In the usual Greek understanding, being enslaved meant the loss of autonomy and dignity, while freedom belonged to those who commanded others and owned property. Diogenes flips this understanding. For him, the real bondage is internal. To be a slave is to be ruled by appetite, fear of public opinion, or dependence on luxury. Someone legally enslaved, but content with little and indifferent to reputation, might be freer in spirit than a king surrounded by flatterers. Even his reaction to his own slave manes running away fits this pattern. Hearing of the escape, Diogenes reportedly remarked that if manes could live without Diogenes, then Diogenes could surely live without manes. The lesson is that attachments which can be broken at any moment are poor foundations for peace of mind. Exile and slavery, then, are not merely biographical incidents. They are woven into a larger argument about the possibility of inner freedom. Diogenes' life serves to dramatize the claim that someone who needs almost nothing is incredibly hard to injure. 7. Diogenes and Alexander the Great. The most famous encounter of Diogenes' life, whether literally true or elaborated by later storytellers, brings him face to face with the most powerful man of his age. When Alexander the Great came to Corinth to be recognized by the Greek states as leader of the campaign against Persia, he heard that the notorious Cynic was in the city and decided to visit him. Alexander found Diogenes lounging in the sunlight, as unperturbed by the arrival of the king as by any other passerby. The conqueror of half the known world stood before a man with no home, no possessions, and no office, and politely asked whether he could do anything for him. Diogenes' reply is one of the most famous lines in ancient philosophy. "Yes, stand a little out of my sun." In that cool dismissal, he expressed the entire Cynic attitude to external power. Alexander could distribute money, honors, or positions, but none of those things were of any importance to a man whose only immediate need was the warmth of the sun. According to the tradition, as Alexander walked away, some of his followers mocked Diogenes. The king, however, is supposed to have said, "But truly, if I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Whether Alexander actually uttered those words does not matter as much as what they say about how later generations saw the Cynic. The king represents the desire to possess the world. The philosopher represents the state of needing nothing, and so being unbribable and unafraid. The anecdote distills the paradoxical power of Diogenes' poverty. The man who appeared to lack everything could inspire envy in the man who superficially had it all. 8. Philosophy in action: nature, poverty, and frank speech. Diogenes did write, although none of his works survive in full. Ancient catalogues attribute to him a Politeia, Republic, works on wealth and ethics, and even tragedies. What we know of his thought, however, comes mostly through reported sayings and the logic visible in his way of life. At its core, his philosophy is ethical and practical. It is about how to live, not about constructing a detailed system of metaphysics or logic. Cynic doctrine, as later summarized, holds that the goal of life is eudaimonia, a deep flourishing and clarity of mind free from delusion or smoke. This goal is achieved by living according to nature, which means aligning one's life with what human beings actually are, rather than with what particular societies demand. For Diogenes, nature dictates that we need food, shelter from extreme weather, and a certain amount of social interaction and rational activity. It does not require fine houses, elaborate clothing, complicated dining rituals, or a constant race for prestige. The closer we live to what nature genuinely requires, the less we are vulnerable to loss and disappointment. Poverty, in this perspective, is not an unfortunate condition imposed from outside, but an active choice and training. Diogenes often presented himself as richer than the wealthy, precisely because his desires were so slim that they were almost always satisfied by gradually discarding items, comforts, and even social expectations. He sought a condition of autarkeia, self-sufficiency, in which he needed almost nothing from others and so could not easily be coerced or tempted. This is why his stories consistently show him giving up possessions and refusing patronage. Each act of letting go is a rehearsal for facing misfortune with equanimity. Linked to this is his commitment to parrhesia, or frank speech. Diogenes considered it his duty to speak the truth as he saw it, regardless of the status of his audience. His shameless lifestyle and his sharp tongue are two sides of the same coin. Both are devices to break the spell of convention, to force people to see how much of their anxiety comes from trying to live up to arbitrary expectations. He was often rude, but his rudeness had a purpose: to wake others as roughly as he had once been awakened by exile and disgrace. 9. Citizen of the world: politics, family, and community. In a deeply city-centered Greek culture, one of Diogenes' most striking declarations was his response when asked where he came from. Rather than naming Sinope or Athens, he answered, "I am a citizen of the world." A cosmopolite's that phrase, one of the earliest recorded uses of what we now call cosmopolitanism, signaled a radical disregard for the boundaries of the polis for Diogenes. The fact that laws and customs differ from city to city showed that they are human inventions, not sacred structures written into the fabric of reality. He treated local identities and honors as matters of indifference compared to the universal question of how to live in accord with human nature. In his Lost Politeia, he seems to have outlined a kind of Cynic city, a community stripped of most traditional institutions. Later reports, often hostile, claim that he envisioned very relaxed or unconventional family arrangements, property held in common, and a minimal role for formal laws and armies. Some of the more extreme details, approving cannibalism in dire necessity, for instance, may have been provocative thought experiments rather than serious policy proposals, designed to push readers to separate what is truly shameful from what merely conflicts with local norms. Whether or not we take the more scandalous passages at face value, it is clear that he believed that the basic bond between human beings is natural kinship rather than shared citizenship. His attitude to other philosophers' political projects was skeptical. He is reported to have mocked Plato's elaborate metaphysical definitions and to have undercut Aristippus, a hedonist who cultivated the favor of rulers. When Aristippus boasted that he was comfortable at a tyrant's court and suggested that Diogenes should learn how to please powerful men so that he would not have to live on lentils, Diogenes replied that if Aristippus could learn to eat lentils, he would not have to flatter tyrants. The contrast captures Diogenes' political stance. He prefers to make himself independent of power rather than to seek a safe place under its shadow. 10. Death, burial, and the stories that follow. As with his birth, the details of Diogenes' death are uncertain and colored by legend. Different sources give different causes. Some say he deliberately held his breath until he died, as a final demonstration of self-control. Others report that he ate a raw octopus and died from the resulting illness. Still others claim he was bitten by dogs while feeding them and succumbed to infection. A more prosaic and probably more plausible account has him dying of old age in Corinth around 324 to 321 BCE. What is consistent across the reports is the sense that he died as he had lived, with little fuss, indifferent to the trappings of honor. The stories of his attitude to burial convey the same philosophy. Asked how he wished to be buried, he is said to have asked that his body be thrown outside the city walls so it could be eaten by wild animals. When friends protested that this would be a desecration, he asked them to provide him with a stick so that he could drive the animals away. They pointed out that he would not be able to use it, since he would no longer be conscious. "In that case," he replied, "why should I care what happens to me when I am dead?" The exchange is designed to show that fear of what will happen to our bodies after death is misplaced, a product of imagination rather than of reason. For someone who has trained himself to distinguish what he can and cannot experience, worries about posthumous honor become absurd. Ironically, the city that once exiled him later honored him. Sinope, we are told, erected a bronze statue to commemorate its most famous and most troublesome son. In this detail, we glimpse yet another reversal. The man who made a career out of scorning conventional honors ends up receiving exactly the sort of permanent public recognition he would have dismissed, while the citizens affirm the value of the very life that once scandalized them. 11. Legacy. From Cynics to Stoics and modern misunderstandings. Diogenes did not found a school in the formal sense. He left no endowed academy or regimented group of students. Instead, he inspired a lineage of individuals who imitated his way of life. The most notable of these was Crates of Thebes, a wealthy man who gave up his fortune to live as a cynic and who carried Diogenes' style of street philosophy into the next generation. Crates in turn taught Zeno of Citium, who would go on to found Stoicism. Through this chain, Diogenes' influence flowed into one of the most important philosophical schools of antiquity. The Stoics preserved many Cynic themes, living according to nature, the idea that external goods are indifferent compared to virtue, the notion of a universal human community, while replacing Diogenes' raw provocations with a more systematic and socially engaged doctrine. In art and literature, Diogenes became a favorite symbol of radical independence. Renaissance painters often include him lying in his jar, indifferent to the riches and ceremonies around him. In Raphael's famous fresco, The School of Athens, he appears sprawled on the steps beneath Plato and Aristotle, a solitary figure whose casual posture contrasts with the dignified arguments above, as if to say that philosophizing with the body can be as powerful as dialectic with the tongue. Writers across the centuries have invoked him when critiquing hypocrisy, materialism, or political pretension. Modern uses of his name sometimes distort his message. Diogenes syndrome, for example, is a psychiatric term for extreme self-neglect and hoarding, conditions that bear little resemblance to a man who prided himself on owning almost nothing, keeping his possessions to a minimum and carefully controlling his needs. Likewise, the word cynic has come to mean someone who disbelieves in genuine goodness and assumes that everyone is out for themselves. The ancient Cynic, however, was not a resigned pessimist. Diogenes did not shrug and say that virtue is impossible. He shouted that it is possible but demands a radical simplicity that most people are unwilling to attempt. His harshness grew out of a fiercely high standard for what a human life could be. 12. The meaning of Diogenes' life. Taken together, the stories of Diogenes form a coherent portrait. He is in many ways a radicalized Socrates. He shares Socrates' conviction that virtue is the only true good, and that external things, wealth, health, reputation, power, are secondary. But where Socrates pursued this conviction through questioning in the marketplace while still serving as a citizen and soldier, Diogenes moves further out. He abandons property, rejects formal civic ties, refuses to found an institutional school, and turns his entire body into a philosophical instrument. His jar, his cloak, his hunger, his jokes, and his shameless acts are all parts of a single project. To show that human beings need far less than they think, and that most of what they chase only makes them more fragile. The legendary encounter with Alexander captures the heart of that project. When the world's most powerful man offers him anything he wants, Diogenes asks only that he move out of the sunlight. It is a dramatization of the claim that power over others is trivial compared to mastery of oneself. It is also a quiet rebuke to the rest of us, who so often trade our freedom for tokens of status. Alexander's reported remark, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes," inverts the usual hierarchy of admiration. The king looks up to the beggar because the beggar is the one person he cannot buy. In the end, Diogenes' life leaves us with a question rather than a system. How much of what we call need is just habit, costume, and fear of other people's opinions? He answers that question for himself by stripping his life down to the barest essentials and finding contentment there. Whether we follow him all the way or not, his example continues to trouble and inspire, reminding us that a human being can be at once destitute in possessions and enormously rich in freedom.